Okay, as we dig our way slowly into a study of the Australian frontier wars, we need to now remind ourselves about issues around language and remember that the language of this topic is tied up in the debate. Every time we say settlement, we need to be conscious of another word that might be more appropriate. What is settlement to one group of people may be invasion to another. What is the best word that you can use for the concept you're trying to describe? How do we choose our language as a key issue? Does it reveal our biases, our perspectives, our upbringing, the agendas we have, our understanding or misunderstanding of events, our knowledge of the evidence? Part of your skill as a historian is choosing the words with which to express your ideas. Do we, at times, pull our punches too much because we don't want to offend? In this debate, are we overly sensitive to offending another person? Or do we appropriately challenge the views of others that are not supported by evidence? We often hear thrown into the current debate questions about whether an idea is politically correct. But we also need to think about, are we being respectful? Are we choosing the right words, the best words? Are we so polite and not wanting to offend that we don't choose the language of our subject area? I'd put to you that if the right word is one that is controversial, perhaps maybe what we need to do is use the right word. But remember, we're not into the business of persuasion. We're into using evidence to support ideas, support hypotheses. So be careful if you're pulling your punches too much. Be appropriately challenging, but choose your language carefully, something that's very hard for many of us to do. As we start a unit like this, I'm going to throw to you that there might be a right way to explore the topic. And this is where I think we might be able to learn from those who have done a lot of work in Holocaust education. The teaching of the Jewish Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis during the 1930s and 40s was done fairly poorly up until the 1970s, 1980s at the very earliest. I would suggest that it was only since the 1990s, 2000s that a carefully thought through approach into how a topic such as that might be taught really reached schools. We're at the early days of teaching and learning about our frontier wars in Australia. I think we need to be discerning the best way in to a topic such as this, and maybe we can learn from those who've dealt with other difficult topics. There's also the question of what do we do once we've learnt about this period of Australian history? How do we respond to the findings, the conclusions, the evidence we uncover? No matter what our outcome is, we need to think about the critical work we do, the detailed thinking we do as historians. How do we work with evidence? And that means we break down sources such as this Monera book review of the military historian John Connor's book, and we pick up upon the language that appears in it. When we see adverbs and adjectives and words such as faded, erupted, verbs that carry connotation, we need to think about how reliable they are. And this is very useful in our ISMG. And does that undermine the usefulness of a source such as this when so many other historians have taken another view? As soon as the representativeness of Monera's book report is called into question, how useful and reliable is it really? Sometimes a minority viewpoint is the right viewpoint, but sometimes to be too far outside the norm might suggest that these ideas are not as worthy as others, as thought through. They're not looking at the right evidence. We have to make judgments. So in a source such as this, I pick up on words like potentially violent places. Perhaps if it was taken out, I think we can say, based upon the evidence that we're going to explore, that the Australian continent when it was settled, still not sure about that word, was a violent place. Certainly a lot of historians are arguing that it wasn't about occasional eruptions of localised warfare, that these were violent places of warfare. And that certainly we should be questioning the concept of whether memory is faded or events have been perhaps overlooked, misremembered, deliberately omitted from history textbooks. So as you start dealing with sources, think about your evaluation skills as a historian as they come up with, as we deal with our ISMGs. Remember, when we're working with evidence, there's this lovely saying here that's in this source that our minds are like parachutes and they function better when they're open. Keep an open mind to the information. Question the perspectives. So as we work through this unit, let's tie this together. The focus of this unit is on developing your understanding of what took place in the colonial years and the first decades after Federation. The way in which we interpret those events is shaped by the strengths and limitations of the available source material, and so you, as historians, have to demonstrate your skills with the source material, and you'll be doing a lot of that. The knowledge you're building is going to help you to make your own decisions, form your own judgments, shape your own view on this, I think, very important part of Australia's history. That'll allow you to play a part, to respond to the national political debates, the media debates around our Indigenous history and the way it interfaced with our colonial period. 2 Prime Ministers, at very least, and I think we can name a few others that have bought into this debate, but at least 2 Prime Ministers have been in conflict quite strongly over this period of Australian history. John Howard, Liberal Party, generally considered a fairly conservative leader, but also a very successful Prime Minister, a very successful leader, considered our settlement as relatively, this colonial period as relatively benign. He saw the European colonisation of Australia as one in which people acted with generally a sense of generosity and openness that brought benefits. And think of this conversation we have about the legacy of British rule. He was saying that Australia was one in which there was relatively peaceful expansion and so forth. He described those people taking an opposite view of Australian history as wearing a black armband historians. On the other hand, on the Labor side of politics, Paul Keating made a speech at Redfern in which he very openly stated what some would see as a controversial progressive point of view that said traditional lands were stolen by European settlers. Both Prime Ministers, both incredibly intelligent people, both with a lot of evidence at their fingertips, both with very, very different views. So as you approach your study of this unit, perhaps you'll start to see whether one or the other or another potential interpretation is the best way forward as we deal with this period of Australian history. I suspect, like all major issues of Australian history, we will find our answer is complexity. Not necessarily following the road taken by another person, not necessarily blindly adopting an interpretation by a historian, a politician, a media figure, by what your friends say, what your teachers say, or what your family say, but coming to your own decision that has some complexity in it. You might find yourself agreeing with some people more than others, but that's the journey we're about to embark on.